The worn duffel bag slipped from Catalina's trembling fingers as she stood at the Greyhound station, her eyes fixed on the little girl tugging at her father's white coat. 6-year-old Wren had somehow escaped the hospital waiting room and was now standing before the woman who'd been living in their home for 3 months, her small face serious with the weight of an impossible request. "You need a home, and I need a mommy," Wren said quietly, her words cutting through the diesel fumes and departure announcements like a blade through silk. Dr. Theron Blackwood appeared behind his daughter, his expression torn between the professional composure that had carried him through years of medical crises and something raw that looked dangerously close to desperation. The bus engine rumbled to life, passengers boarding with the efficient indifference of people accustomed to goodbyes. What none of them knew was that this moment would force a choice between the safety of social expectations and the terrifying possibility that love might be worth more than reputation. 3 months earlier, the emergency department at St. Mary's Hospital hummed with its usual controlled chaos as Dr. Theron Blackwood completed his final patient notes. At 36, he'd learned to compartmentalize tragedy, treating each case with clinical precision while maintaining the emotional distance necessary for survival in emergency medicine. His colleagues respected his cool efficiency, the way he could suture a wound while simultaneously reviewing X-rays, his ability to deliver devastating diagnoses with gentle authority that somehow made families feel supported rather than abandoned. Wren sat in the corner of his office, her small tongue poking out in concentration as she colored what appeared to be a family of elephants holding trunks. At 6 years old, she'd adapted to hospital life with the resilience children showed when they had no other choice. Her after-school routine involved homework at his desk, dinner from the cafeteria, and carefully orchestrated bedtimes that worked around his unpredictable schedule. Her mother had died when she was 3, cancer that moved too fast for even the best medical intervention, leaving Theron to navigate single parenthood while maintaining his demanding career. The juggling act was exhausting in ways that medical school had never prepared him for. Between surgery schedules and parent-teacher conferences, between emergency calls and bedtime stories, Theron often felt like he was failing at both roles simultaneously. He'd learned to pack extra clothes in his locker for the inevitable spills and playground accidents, to keep a drawer full of crackers and juice boxes for the afternoons when cafeteria food didn't appeal to 6-year-old sensibilities, to recognize the difference between Wren's "I'm tired" cry and her "I miss mommy" cry based on subtle variations in pitch and duration. "Daddy, the lady in room 4 looks scared," Wren observed without looking up from her drawing, her small hand moving the crayon in careful circles around an elephant's ear. Not hurt scared, the kind of scared that makes you want to hide but you don't know where to go. Her assessment was delivered with the matter-of-fact directness that children used to process adult emotions they couldn't fully understand, though her insight had become uncomfortably perceptive since her mother's death. Theron glanced toward the monitors, noting the young woman who'd been brought in unconscious earlier that day. The police report suggested human trafficking, though she'd provided no information beyond a first name. Catalina. Her chart told a story written in medical terminology, healed fractures that spoke of systematic violence, signs of prolonged malnutrition, defensive wounds on her hands and forearms that suggested she'd learned to protect her face and vital organs from repeated attacks. What the chart couldn't capture was the way she held herself even in sleep, coiled like a spring ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Theron had seen enough trauma cases to recognize the signs, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the way she'd instinctively turned toward the sound of Wren's voice during her brief moments of consciousness, or how her breathing had seemed to calm when his daughter's soft chatter drifted through the observation window. There was a gentleness beneath the survival instincts that reminded him of wounded animals who still remembered kindness, who hadn't yet given up hope that the world might contain more than cruelty. "She probably hasn't had anyone be nice to her in a very long time," Wren continued, now adding elaborate flowers around the elephant family. Maybe she forgot what safe feels like. The observation was delivered with 6-year-old wisdom, the kind of emotional intelligence that emerged when children were forced to understand loss and fear earlier than they should have. Theron found himself studying his daughter as she worked, noting the careful way she'd learned to read adult moods and respond accordingly. In the 3 years since Sarah's death, Wren had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when he was struggling, appearing at his elbow with her favorite stuffed animal when he'd had a particularly difficult case, offering to help with tasks that were clearly beyond her capabilities, asking if he needed hugs with the earnest concern of someone who understood that adults sometimes needed comfort too. The realization that his 6-year-old was taking care of him as much as he was taking care of her sat heavy in his chest, a weight that seemed to grow heavier each day. He'd thought he was managing well enough. Wren was fed, clothed, loved, and academically successful. But moments like this, when her emotional maturity shone through her childish drawings, reminded him of all the ways his grief and exhaustion might be shaping her development in ways he couldn't fully control or predict. Over the next several hours, Theron found himself checking on room 4 more frequently than medical necessity required. There was something about Catalina's careful watchfulness, the way she tracked movement in the hallway with eyes that had learned to catalogue potential threats, the way she observed Wren's artwork through the window with an expression that shifted from wariness to something that looked like longing, that made him reluctant to simply process her case and move on to the next emergency. Each time he entered her room, he noticed small details that spoke to a person rather than just a case file. The way she automatically positioned herself with a clear view of both the door and window. How her hands rested protectively over her abdomen even in sleep, as if guarding against blows that might never come again. The careful way she watched his movements, not with the glazed resignation of someone who'd given up, but with the sharp attention of someone still fighting to survive with dignity intact. "Do you have somewhere to go when you're discharged?" he asked during his final check, settling into the chair beside her bed with deliberate, non-threatening movements. The question was both professional protocol and personal concern, though he couldn't quite articulate why her answer felt important beyond standard social work procedures. The social worker mentioned shelters. Catalina replied, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned not to expect much from official assistance. "I'll manage. I always do." The statement was delivered without self-pity, simply recognition of reality as she'd learned to navigate it. But Theron caught the slight tremor in her hands as she spoke, the only sign that managing had come at a cost she was still paying. He found himself thinking about Wren's observation, about what it meant to forget what safe felt like, about the difference between surviving and actually living. The professional part of his mind catalogued standard procedures, social services referrals, trauma counseling resources, legal advocacy programs. But the father part, the part that woke up every morning wondering if he was doing enough for his own daughter, recognized something in Catalina's careful composure that felt familiar. "My daughter likes your company," he said, following her gaze toward the window where Wren was packing up her coloring supplies with the methodical efficiency she'd learned from watching him organize medical equipment. "She's been drawing extra pictures to show you. She doesn't usually warm up to strangers that quickly." The observation was true, but also a testing of waters he wasn't sure he should be navigating. For the first time since regaining consciousness, Catalina's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "She has kind eyes," she said quietly, her voice carrying a wistfulness that made Theron's chest tighten unexpectedly. "Children with kind eyes usually have kind parents." The statement felt like an assessment, as if she'd learned to read family dynamics from hospital windows, to recognize safety in the way adults interacted with their children. The compliment caught him off guard, partly because it came from someone who had no reason to trust adults, and partly because it made him suddenly aware of how she was looking at him, not with the wariness she'd shown earlier, but with something that might have been cautious hope. He thought about the countless nights he'd questioned every parenting decision, every moment of impatience or exhaustion, every time he'd chosen work obligations over bedtime stories because someone else's emergency couldn't wait. An idea formed in his mind, impractical and probably inappropriate, but persistent nonetheless. He thought about Wren's careful maturity, about the babysitters who never quite understood her bedtime routine, about the way his daughter's face lit up whenever she felt genuinely useful, rather than merely tolerated. He thought about Catalina's gentle attention to Wren's artwork, about the way survival instincts and kindness could coexist in the same person. "Catalina," he said slowly, the words emerging before his professional caution could edit them. "I have a proposition. I need help with childcare and household management, someone trustworthy who can be there when my hospital schedule conflicts with Wren's needs. You need stable housing while you get back on your feet. It would be temporary, with fair wages and your own room, until you decide what you want to do next." The offer hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they were ready to cross. Theron watched her expression cycle through surprise, calculation, and something that might have been hope before settling into careful consideration. He realized he was holding his breath, waiting for her response as if it mattered more than simple employment arrangements should matter. The arrangement that followed was practical and carefully structured. Catalina would work as a live-in housekeeper and nanny in exchange for room, board, and a modest salary. Everything was professional, documented, and completely reasonable on the surface. What the paperwork couldn't capture was the way Theron's hands shook slightly as he signed the employment agreement, or how he found himself reorganizing the guest room 3 times to make sure it felt welcoming rather than institutional. What couldn't be documented was the transformation that began the very first morning. Theron woke to scents that belonged in memories rather than his sterile bachelor household. Real breakfast cooking, bread rising, coffee that had been brewed with attention rather than desperation. He descended the stairs in his scrubs, expecting to find Catalina efficiently preparing a functional meal, and instead discovered something that looked like magic. Pancakes shaped like flowers covered the griddle, their golden edges crisp and perfect. Scrambled eggs scrambled with what appeared to be fresh herbs from the neglected pots on his windowsill. Pots he'd forgotten contained anything other than weeds. Catalina stood at the stove with her back to him, humming softly in Spanish while she worked, and for a moment he felt like he was witnessing something sacred, something his house had been missing without him realizing it. The domesticity of the scene hit him like a physical blow. He'd grown so accustomed to rushed mornings, cereal bars eaten standing up while reviewing patient files, coffee consumed in the car while driving Wren to school, that he'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone care enough to make breakfast beautiful rather than merely functional. His throat tightened unexpectedly as he realized this was what Wren had been missing, what he'd been too exhausted and overwhelmed to provide. The gentle attention that transformed routine into ritual, survival into living. "Daddy, look!" Wren's delighted voice drew his attention to the kitchen table, where his normally serious daughter was giggling at pancakes arranged to look like a garden. "Catalina made flour pancakes, and she says we can plant a real garden this weekend." The joy in his daughter's voice was something he hadn't heard since before her mother's illness. Bright and uncomplicated, and completely present in the moment, rather than shadowed by the careful responsibility she'd learned to carry. Theron found himself memorizing the scene. Wren's face illuminated by pure happiness, Catalina's gentle smile as she watched his daughter's reaction, the morning sunlight streaming through windows that someone had obviously cleaned until they sparkled. The kitchen felt alive in a way it hadn't since Sarah's death, filled with the kind of warmth that couldn't be purchased or prescribed but somehow emerged when people cared about each other's comfort rather than just their own survival. "I hope you don't mind," Catalina said, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone who understood she was a guest in someone else's life. "I found herbs growing on the windowsill, and Wren mentioned that she liked pancakes shaped like things. I wanted to thank you both for... She paused, searching for words that could encompass the magnitude of being offered safety when you'd forgotten it existed. Don't apologize for making our house feel like a home, Theron replied, the words emerging with more honesty than he'd intended. This is the first time in months that breakfast has felt like something to enjoy, rather than just fuel for the day ahead. The admission revealed more than he'd meant to share about his own exhaustion, about the ways grief and single parenthood had reduced his life to mere functionality. Over the following days, Theron found himself studying the subtle changes in his daughter's behavior with the clinical attention he usually reserved for patient assessments. Wren had always been well-behaved, perhaps too well-behaved for a 6-year-old, but her compliance had carried an undertone of premature responsibility that had worried him more than any tantrum could have. She'd learned to be helpful rather than demanding, grateful rather than expectant, careful not to add to his burdens rather than secure in her right to his attention. Now she laughed more freely, the sound echoing through the house at unexpected moments. She asked for help with buttons and shoelaces without the apologetic preface that used to accompany such requests. Most remarkably, she occasionally acted like the child she actually was rather than the small adult she'd felt obligated to become, leaving toys scattered in the living room, requesting seconds at dinner, falling asleep on the couch during movie nights instead of dutifully marching herself to bed at precisely 8 o'clock. She braided my hair this morning, Wren announced one evening as Theron arrived home from a particularly difficult shift involving a car accident and 2 cardiac arrests. Not just a regular braid, a French braid that stays neat all day and doesn't hurt when I sleep on it. And she taught me how to fold fitted sheets properly, which is apparently very advanced domestic engineering. The technical assessment was delivered with the same seriousness Wren applied to her multiplication tables, but there was pride in her voice that spoke to feeling genuinely accomplished rather than merely dutiful. Theron realized he was witnessing something he'd thought might be lost forever, his daughter's natural curiosity and enthusiasm emerging from beneath the protective shell of maturity she'd constructed after her mother's death. Catalina seemed to understand instinctively how to nurture Wren's childhood while respecting her intelligence, how to offer guidance without making her feel incompetent, how to create space for mistakes and discoveries without judgment or impatience. But it was the smaller moments that caught Theron off guard and made him question everything he thought he knew about managing his household and his heart. Walking into the living room to find Catalina reading to Wren in both English and Spanish, watching his daughter absorb stories about brave girls and wise grandmothers with the hungry attention of someone discovering that the world was larger and more magical than she'd previously understood. The sight of them curled together on the couch, Wren's small hand tracing letters in a language she was learning to love, made his chest tighten with gratitude, and something more complicated that he wasn't ready to examine, or finding them in the kitchen together on Saturday mornings, Catalina patiently teaching Wren to knead bread while explaining that cooking was a form of love made visible, that feeding people well was how you showed them they mattered. The lesson was clearly about more than baking techniques. It was about care and attention, about the difference between providing sustenance and creating nourishment, about the ways people could take care of each other through daily acts of kindness rather than grand gestures. My grandmother always said that a house becomes a home when it smells like bread baking and sounds like children laughing, Catalina explained one Saturday morning as they waited for loaves to rise, her voice carrying wistfulness for memories that clearly brought both joy and pain. She said those 2 things together meant that people were taking care of each other properly. The wisdom was simple but profound, offered without expectation that Theron would understand or respond, simply shared because the moment seemed to call for it. Theron found himself lingering in doorways to watch these exchanges, struck by how naturally Catalina seemed to understand what Wren needed, not just practically, but emotionally. She never tried to replace Wren's memories of her mother, never suggested that she could fill a role that belonged to someone irreplaceable. Instead, she helped his daughter add new experiences and traditions that honored the past while creating space for growth and healing, building bridges between who Ren had been and who she was becoming. The realization that his own healing was happening alongside his daughter's crept up on him gradually, revealed in moments when he found himself humming while reviewing medical charts or looking forward to coming home rather than simply enduring the transition between work and sleep. The house felt different, not just cleaner and more organized, but somehow more alive, filled with the kind of warmth that came from people who genuinely cared about each other's daily happiness, rather than just meeting basic survival needs. These late evening conversations, conducted over cups of tea while Ren slept peacefully upstairs, became the foundation of something neither of them quite knew how to name. Something deeper than professional collaboration, built on shared commitment to Ren's welfare, but extending beyond parental duties. "You're a good father," Catalina told him one night, her observation prompted by watching him help Ren with a challenging math assignment. "She's lucky to have someone who sees her as a complete person rather than just a problem to be managed." "You're good for both of us," Theron replied, the admission emoting before his professional caution could edit it. "Ren is happier than she's been since her mother died, and I'm remembering how to be present in my own life rather than just surviving it." Winter melted into spring, and with it came a garden that transformed their backyard. Catalina worked alongside Ren to plant vegetables and flowers, teaching her about soil preparation while creating spaces that would bloom with color. Theron found himself looking forward to weekends for the pleasure of watching his daughter learn skills that connected her to cycles of growth and renewal. "Look, Daddy," Ren called one Saturday morning. "The sunflowers are taller than me now, and Catalina says they'll be taller than you before summer ends." But it was the way Catalina looked at him over Ren's head, sharing the joy of the moment, silently including him in the magic they were creating together, that made Theron's chest tighten with emotions he'd been trying not to examine too closely. For the first time since his wife's death, he found himself thinking about the future in terms of possibility, rather than simple endurance. The conversation that changed everything happened on a warm May evening as they sat on the front porch, watching Ren practice cartwheels while fireflies began their nightly dance. "I need to tell you something," Catalina said quietly. "I've been in contact with immigration services about my status. There's a possibility I might be eligible for a special visa program. It would mean permanent legal status, the right to work anywhere, to build a real life here." "That's wonderful," Theron replied, though his enthusiasm felt forced. "The thing is," Catalina continued, "if I get the visa, I'll have real choices for the first time. I could stay in Denver, or I could go anywhere. Cities with larger Spanish-speaking communities, places where I might have better opportunities." "What do you want?" Theron asked, his question both simple and impossibly complex. "I want to belong somewhere permanently," Catalina said slowly. "I want to be part of something that won't disappear when circumstances change. I want to help Ren grow up. I want—" She paused, her next words barely audible. "I want to stay here with you and Ren, not as an employee, but as family." Before Theron could respond, Ren appeared. "Are you guys talking about serious grown-up stuff?" she asked. "We're talking about the future," Theron replied honestly. "About what we all want our family to look like." "Oh," Ren said, settling herself between them. "Are you finally going to admit that you love each other? Because that's been pretty obvious for a while now." "She's right," Theron said quietly. "We do love each other, and we are already a family in every way that matters. The only question is whether we're brave enough to make it official." "I'm saying that I love you," Theron replied, reaching for Catalina's hand. "That Ren loves you, That we want you to be part of our family because what we've built together is worth fighting for." The kiss that followed was witnessed by fireflies and a 6-year-old who cheered loud enough to startle the neighbors. But even as they celebrated this breakthrough, external pressures would test their newfound commitment. The first warning came from Dr. Margaret Chen during what should have been a casual conversation in the hospital cafeteria. "Theron, there have been some discussions about your living arrangements," she said, her voice carrying the uncomfortable responsibility of delivering unwelcome news. "Board members are concerned about professional boundaries, about physicians developing personal relationships with former patients." The words hit him like ice water, forcing him to confront the reality he'd been carefully avoiding. In the sanctuary of his home, surrounded by the warmth Catalina and Ren had created together, it had been easy to forget that their unconventional family existed within a larger social structure that operated by different rules. The hospital board wasn't interested in flour pancakes or French braids, or the way his daughter had learned to laugh freely again. They saw liability, impropriety, a respected physician whose judgment might be compromised by emotional involvement with someone whose background made them uncomfortable. That evening, as Theron sat in his study reviewing the conversation, he found himself facing an internal war that felt more brutal than any medical emergency he'd ever managed. On one side stood everything he'd worked for, his reputation, his career, the financial security that ensured Ren's future education and opportunities. The respect of colleagues who'd watched him build a practice from nothing, who'd supported him through Sarah's illness and death, who'd trusted him with their most complex cases and their own professional development. On the other side stood the possibility of genuine happiness, the first real peace he'd known since becoming a widower, the sight of his daughter becoming a child again instead of a small adult carrying burdens too heavy for her shoulders. Catalina's presence had transformed not just their daily routines, but their capacity for joy, their ability to imagine a future that contained more than mere survival. The rational part of his mind, the part trained in risk assessment and evidence-based decision-making, catalogued all the ways loving Catalina could destroy everything he'd built. Professional censure, lost referrals, whispered doubts about his competence and judgment that could follow him for years. The possibility that fighting for their relationship might ultimately hurt Ren by damaging the career that provided her stability and opportunities. But the father part of him, the part that had watched his daughter's face light up with genuine happiness for the first time in years, recognized that some risks were worth taking. That protecting Ren from social disapproval might mean condemning her to a life where love was always secondary to propriety, where the authentic connections that made life meaningful were sacrificed for the appearance of respectability. He thought about the nights he'd lain awake after Sarah's death, wondering if he'd have the strength to raise Ren alone, questioning every decision, every moment of impatience or exhaustion. He'd promised himself then that he would do whatever it took to give his daughter a good life, but he'd never considered that good might mean more than material security and academic achievement. He'd never imagined it might mean showing her that love was worth fighting for, that families could be built on choice and care rather than just biological connection and social convention. The internal struggle was visible in small ways over the following days, the way his hands trembled slightly as he signed patient charts, how he found himself staring out his office window instead of focusing on medical consultations, the careful distance he suddenly maintained when speaking to colleagues who might report back to the board. He was walking a tightrope between two worlds, trying to maintain professional composure while his personal life was being scrutinized and judged by people who'd never seen Catalina help Ren with nightmares or watched her transform their house into a home. That evening, Theron found himself explaining the hospital's concerns to Catalina and Ren, his voice steady, but his heart racing as he watched their faces process the implications of external judgment on their private happiness. "So they think I'm too damaged to make my own decisions about who I love?" Catalina asked, her voice carrying controlled hurt that made his chest tighten with protective fury. They think I'm so grateful for basic kindness that I can't distinguish between obligation and genuine affection. The assumption underlying the board's concerns, that someone with Catalina's background couldn't make autonomous choices about relationships, that her feelings must be contaminated by gratitude or desperation rather than genuine emotion, infuriated him in ways that challenged his usually calm professional demeanor. He found himself clenching his fists beneath the dinner table, fighting the urge to drive back to the hospital and confront every board member who'd questioned her agency and dignity. They think unconventional relationships create complications for people in public positions, Theron replied carefully, though his diplomatic language couldn't disguise the anger burning in his voice. They're worried about institutional liability, about maintaining the hospital's reputation with donors and community leaders who might not understand our situation. But that's not fair, Wren protested with the moral clarity that children brought to situations adults overcomplicated through politics and convention. You love each other, and we're happy together, and we're not hurting anyone. Why does anyone else get to decide whether our family is okay? Her indignation was both touching and logically unassailable, though it forced Theron to confront the complex social and professional pressures that governed adult choices in ways that 6-year-old logic couldn't fully encompass. The board's concerns weren't entirely unreasonable from an institutional perspective. Hospitals operated in conservative communities where unconventional relationships could indeed affect funding and referrals. But the personal cost of acquiescing to those pressures felt increasingly unbearable as he watched the fear creep back into Catalina's eyes and the careful maturity return to Wren's posture. The tipping point came 3 weeks later when Dr. Harrison Webb, the chief of staff, appeared in Theron's office with the expression of someone delivering an ultimatum disguised as friendly advice. "Theron, the board has asked me to speak with you about resolving your domestic situation," Harrison said, settling into the chair across from his desk with the comfortable authority of someone accustomed to having his suggestions followed without question. "There's been talk about a leave of absence to address personal matters that might be affecting your professional judgment. Nothing formal yet, but the message is clear. Unconventional family situations create unwelcome attention and should be resolved quickly and quietly." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, couched in language that suggested concern for his well-being while making it clear that his career depended on conforming to social expectations he'd never explicitly agreed to uphold. Theron felt something cold and sharp settle in his stomach as he realized the board wasn't simply questioning his judgment. They were questioning his right to make personal choices that didn't align with their vision of appropriate professional behavior. "And what exactly would constitute resolving my situation?" Theron asked, his voice carrying the dangerous calm that his colleagues had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "What specific actions would demonstrate that my personal life no longer poses a threat to institutional respectability?" Harrison's expression suggested he'd hoped to avoid such direct language, but he pressed forward with the uncomfortable efficiency of someone delivering a message he didn't necessarily agree with but couldn't afford to refuse. "The arrangement with your employee has evolved beyond appropriate professional boundaries. The board feels that maintaining clear distinctions between charity and personal involvement would be in everyone's best interest." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise what was being demanded, that he choose between his career and his heart, between professional security and personal happiness, between the approval of people who'd never met Catalina and the love of people who'd become essential to his daily peace. The choice felt impossible and infuriating, forcing him to weigh abstract concepts like reputation against concrete realities like Wren's laughter and Catalina's gentle presence in their morning routines. "I have to go," Catalina announced that evening, her words delivered with the mechanical precision of someone who'd made an impossible decision and was determined to see it through. "I found a job in Portland, restaurant work with housing included. It's an opportunity to build an independent life away from these complications." The announcement hit the dinner table like a physical blow, transforming their sanctuary of domestic peace into a battlefield where love and practical reality fought for dominance. Theron felt his carefully constructed world tilting on its axis as he watched Catalina's face, seeing in her expression the same protective withdrawal he'd witnessed in trauma patients who'd decided that feeling nothing was safer than risking further pain. "Catalina, please," Theron began, but she held up a hand to stop him, her eyes already distant as she began the emotional withdrawal that would make leaving possible. "This isn't about what we want," she said firmly, though her voice carried undertones of devastation that belied her controlled demeanor. "This is about what's best for everyone, especially Wren. She deserves a father whose reputation isn't questioned, whose career isn't threatened by association with someone whose history makes people uncomfortable." The selflessness of her decision was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Theron found himself facing the terrible irony that the woman he loved was willing to sacrifice their happiness to protect his professional standing, the same professional standing that felt increasingly meaningless without her presence to give his life dimension beyond mere achievement. The board's concerns, which had seemed so pressing and legitimate just hours earlier, now felt abstract and cruel when weighed against the concrete reality of losing the person who'd taught his daughter to laugh freely again. "But we love you," Wren said from the doorway, having crept downstairs to eavesdrop on the conversation that would determine her family's future. Her small voice carried the weight of someone who'd already lost one mother and couldn't understand why adults were choosing to take away another. "And you love us. Why isn't that enough? Why do other people get to decide that love is wrong when it makes everyone happy?" The question hung in the air like an accusation, forcing Theron to confront the cowardice underlying his inability to fight for what mattered most. His daughter's moral clarity was devastating in its simplicity, challenging him to explain why professional approval should matter more than personal fulfillment, why the opinions of people who'd never witnessed their family's happiness should determine its future. "Sometimes loving people means protecting them from the problems your presence creates," Catalina replied, kneeling to embrace the little girl who'd become the daughter of her heart, if not her blood. "Sometimes the best way to show love is to remove yourself from situations that cause pain for people you care about." But even as she spoke the words, Theron could see the doubt in her eyes, the struggle between self-preservation and the desire to fight for what they'd built together. She was making the choice she thought was noble and responsible, but it was also the choice that felt safest for someone who'd learned that attachment led to loss, that hope was often followed by disappointment. Watching her pack that night, seeing her fold the clothes Wren had helped her organize, and carefully wrap the small gifts his daughter had made for her, Theron felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of what courage actually meant. He'd spent years priding himself on his professional bravery, his ability to make life and death decisions under pressure, to deliver difficult diagnoses with compassion, to maintain composure in the face of medical emergencies that would paralyze most people. But faced with the prospect of losing Catalina, he realized that professional courage was different from personal courage, that making decisions about other people's lives was easier than risking everything for his own happiness. The board could threaten his career, colleagues could question his judgment, community leaders could whisper about his choices, but none of that would matter if he lost the woman who'd reminded him what it meant to be fully alive, who'd shown his daughter that families could be built on love rather than just obligation and circumstance. The internal war he'd been fighting reached its crescendo as he watched Catalina close her suitcase with the careful finality of someone who'd made peace with sacrifice. Everything in him screamed against letting her leave, against allowing other people's fears and prejudices to determine his family's future. But the weight of practical concerns, Wren's security, his professional obligations, the financial stability that ensured his daughter's opportunities, held him frozen between action and paralysis. He thought about Sarah's death, about the promises he'd made to protect Ren from further loss and uncertainty. But he also thought about the promises he'd made to himself about living fully rather than just surviving, about showing his daughter that love was worth fighting for, even when the fight was difficult and uncertain. The competing obligations felt impossible to reconcile, forcing him to choose between different versions of being a good father and a good man. The bus station was crowded with people beginning journeys toward unknown futures when they arrived the next morning. Catalina sat on a plastic chair with her ticket clutched in trembling fingers, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes bright with unshed tears. "You need a home, and I need a mommy," Ren said suddenly, having apparently decided that adult politeness was insufficient for the magnitude of what was happening. Her words carried the simple truth that had been too complicated for adults to acknowledge. "Sweetheart," Catalina replied, kneeling to meet Ren's eyes one final time. "Sometimes people have to make decisions that feel wrong because they think those decisions will protect the people they love. But that doesn't mean the love goes away." The bus loading announcement echoed through the terminal, and Catalina stood with movements that looked more like defeat than determination. She kissed Ren's forehead, shook Theron's hand with formal politeness, and walked toward the gate without looking back. The bus pulled away, carrying Catalina toward an uncertain future in a city where no one knew her history. As they watched it disappear, Ren turned to her father with an expression that mixed heartbreak with challenge. "Daddy, are we just going to let her go? Are we going to pretend like she was never part of our family?" Theron knelt beside his daughter, his hands gentle on her shoulders as he struggled to find words. The sunflowers in their garden would be blooming soon, reaching toward the light with the stubborn optimism that Catalina had taught them both. Some things, he realized, were worth any risk. "Sometimes, sweetheart," he said slowly, "people need time to understand that some battles are worth fighting, no matter how scary they seem. And sometimes—" He paused, looking toward where the bus had disappeared, then back at his daughter's earnest face. "Sometimes love finds a way." The house felt empty that night, but not the resigned emptiness they'd known before Catalina's arrival. This emptiness carried the weight of memory and possibility. As Theron tucked Ren into bed, she looked up at him with eyes that carried both sadness and unshakable faith. "Daddy, do you think she knows we're not giving up on her?" "I think," Theron replied, smoothing her hair with gentle fingers, "that love has a way of making itself known, even when people try to run from it." Outside their windows, Denver glittered with dreams and possibilities. Somewhere among those lights, a young woman who'd learned to call their house home was beginning another chapter. And in a quiet house that felt too empty for the love it contained, a father and daughter were learning that sometimes the most important stories didn't end. They just waited for the right moment to continue.